All right, hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm excited for this webinar tonight with Gary Lawless. My name is Julia McLeod. I'm the Outreach Director for the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust. I wanted to let you know about some other upcoming webinars. In August, we have one about bats' behavior in wind farms. In September, about global climate justice movement. In October about rockweed research, and then more after that. So I hope you can join us for some of those. We have recordings of all our past monthly webinars in the Stories of Change series on our website. Got a lot of great speakers, so I encourage you to check those out as well. So just about the webinar tonight. So we have Gary Lawless with us talking about words and watersheds. And if you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to type them into the chat. And I will come on and ask Gary some of those questions at the end, but you can type them in whenever you're thinking of them if you'd like. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Gary.
Thank you. Thank you. I will caution people, you don't have to worry. I'm just not going to just read a lot of poems. It's okay. The idea of stories of change, I wanted to talk about sort of the change in my life as a young Mainer. I grew up in Belfast on Penobscot Bay, and I in the 50s and 60s, and it was a very polluted place in Belfast. The chicken companies had polluted the bay pretty well, so we couldn't swim in the bay. People didn't keep their boats in the bay in Belfast, and it was we were aware pretty early as young kids about the unpleasant effects of unregulated pollution from industries on the sides of watersheds. So growing up, I was really interested in the natural world and liked to be outdoors as much as I could. But then in high school, I also became interested in poetry, and especially poetry which wrote about the natural world and ways of expressing humans' differing experiences of the natural world. So I went through high school in Belfast, and then I went to college at Colby in Waterville, and I discovered through a book called The Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac, I discovered that there were poets who were reading Native American texts and natural sciences and Buddhist texts, and writing poetry about climbing mountains and walking in the woods and exploring the wilderness of not only the wilderness of your mind, but the wilderness of the exterior wilderness of the natural world. So at the end of my college career at Colby, I wrote to my favorite poet of the time, a man named Gary Snyder, who was writing a lot about the natural world and was sort of riding a crest of the late 60s blossoming of information, of interest in ecological subjects. So I wrote to him and said, instead of going to graduate school, that I wanted to come and live with him at his place in Northern California up in the mountains and be his apprentice, which I was basing on the Renaissance, where if you wanted to be an artist and you would find an artist who had the skills that you wanted to learn, and you would apprentice yourself to that person, and gradually over a long period of time you would acquire the skills that you needed to work in that craft. So I hitchhiked out to California with all these glorious ideas of becoming a poet, and it was going to be wonderful. We're going to sit around and drink tea and talk about poetry. This is not what happened. My idea when I saw Julia's theme of stories of change, I thought I would talk about the change which occurred in my life at that point. That was 1973, and I hitchhiked out to California, and I arrived there, and living at Gary Snyder's house, and all these people were coming up from the Bay Area, San Francisco, with all these ideas, and to me, as a young person from Maine, they were pretty new to me, pretty new ideas and pretty interesting. And the big theme of that summer when I arrived, the big item of conversation and of study and practice was the idea of what they were calling bioregionalism or biological regionalism or watershed consciousness. And so instead of going and learning about the poetic traditions, I was immediately swept into this long conversation among a lot of people about the idea of watershed consciousness. And what essentially what they were looking at was trying to figure out where they lived, where we all live, not in terms of imposed human political boundaries, but in terms of all the other borders and boundaries and ways of looking at the map that didn't necessarily have these straight lines drawn on them by humans. So we were trying to figure out how do you live as a good citizen of a particular place on the planet? How do you live in that particular place doing as little damage as possible to the systems which are already occurring around you? Um, and how do you define what your watershed is? So we were looking at it in a lot of different ways, and we're starting from the microcosmic. Your body is basically a watershed or a bioregion for a lot of little microbes who aren't going to make it outside of your skin. If they get out into the outer world, they're just not going to make it. So your body is basically a watershed. So we were looking from that basically to the Milky Way. Like there's big watersheds and there's small watersheds, and which way of defining where you are would you like to choose, and how what is it that defines a place in those terms? So we were looking at places that were determined by river systems or oceans, places that were determined by mountain ranges, by the varieties of plant life, trees, forests, particular plants, particular species of animals, um, particular languages. When you look at a map of early North America, there are many indigenous languages spread across the map. So were you living within Penobscot territory, within a Wabanaki territory, where you're living within a Penobscot language range or Passamaquoddy or Mi'kmaq or that, or is this a place where English speaking people arrived, or is this a place where French speaking people arrived? Like my bookstore, Beth Leonard and I own a bookstore in Brunswick, and Brunswick was for quite a while a Franco-American town, and the French language was a language which you would hear everywhere. That has gradually changed. For a while, it was sort of a bad thing to speak that language. If you were a Native American, it was a really bad thing, according to the English, to speak their language, and you were taken away from your family and from your culture, and so language is also one of those. But language travels, language is migratory, much is migratory. So we're trying to look at a place and trying to figure out what is it that causes you to belong there, what connections cause you to belong there, or what connections are you messing up when you impose yourself on a particular place, and so looking at, for example, in a watershed, looking at your body of water and then following it upstream and seeing where originally all the sources of that water would be. So in Harpswell, if you're looking at Casco Bay and a larger body, the Gulf of Maine, you're looking at all the various streams that feed into the various rivers that feed into Casco Bay or Merry Meeting Bay and down to the sea. Or where I live on Damascotta Lake, in the Damascotta Lake watershed, and we look at the various water that feeds into the lake, and then the lake goes out and feeds into the Damascotta River, and then the river goes out to the sea. Basically, we can extend that connection down to Pemaquid. And in looking at that, we also see a very important migratory species, the alewives, who come up that river into that lake, usually in mid-May, and we have celebrations to welcome them. We have a party every year to welcome the alewives back, which seems to me a very bioregional kind of thing, a very watershed activity, welcoming the fish back, as is studying dam removals to see how do we get salmon back, how do we get shad back, how do we get sturgeon into places, how do we get alewives, how do we treat the eels when they come back downriver, do we chop them to pieces in turbines, and then looking up the rivers, we also look to see what ingredients are being put into the river upstream, and then what we're putting into the river that is going downstream. Um, Again, looking at how to be a good citizen, you need to be concerned about that. Um, if in fact you are concerned about all the other species with whom you share the place that you live. So just defining that idea of a watershed, it was a really great project because we had we had scientists, geologists, biologists, we had theater people, we had musicians, we had Zen Buddhists, we had poets, we had singers, a lot of people trying to figure out where they lived and what do you call it? Because when you look at the map now, the names of places are sort of imposed colonialist names. In Maine, there's a great treasure of the names. We have fortunately kept record of the prior names of a lot of places, and you know, there's a Fanny Hardy Ekstrom has a wonderful book of place names of the Maine coast, and you can look at the research that's been done into the earlier indigenous names for places, a lot of which were describing what was happening there, the possibility of that place. So there's a carrying place here, or there's a bay here, or here's where the shad are, or there are rapids here, or here's a place to dry the fish. So if you could learn the names as you traveled, it would be like having a Delorme atlas in your head. You knew where you were and you knew what needed to happen there. You knew that the next place in the river there was a rapid that you might have to carry around, or here's a good place for the sturgeon to gather and you could catch them. So the naming process, we come and name them after places in England or name them after families, and even to the point of botanizing, we give plants Latin names based on Joseph Banks or some other celebrated white male scientist whose name gets to go with those plants. So a fun project I like to do with younger people when we go on walks in preserves is renaming everything. You know, what would this plant call itself? What would these other trees call this tree? What are they doing? What are they talking about? How are they communicating? What is language in your watershed? How do what's the microbial language happening underneath the ground? How are the birds communicating with each other? There are all these languages happening in the place where you are all the time. There's all this communication going. How do you become more and more aware of that communication and gradually become part of that conversation rather than something that just is an onlooker and not an active participant? How do you participate in the conversation of your place? So as a poet, you know, I like to encourage people to think about how, if you're speaking from a place or speaking about a particular place, are you just speaking about your human experience, or are you taking into account the experiences of the other species around you? And how do you know about that without a great intensive study? You can never learn enough about the place where you are. There's always more to learn. We none of us can learn about all of the systems within which we are living our lives. There's just so much going on below the ground, on the surface of the ground, above us, coming in from, coming in from dark energy and dark matter. If you're thinking of the Milky Way as your watershed, there's a whole lot going on that isn't even explained yet. But that's true even on the ground level. There's a lot, like microbial thing, the mycorrhizals, stuff happening below the ground is just being really looked into, and those conversations are trees actually conversing with each other? Are they supplying needs for each other? Are they helping each other out? Maybe it takes a village of trees. Maybe it takes a village of everything. And the lichens are not even one species. There's something happening there that's more than one. And then you're learning from the place, and you're learning about living there and who lives there. But then there's also, like with the alewives, there are constantly the migratory friends who are coming through. And in Harpswell, that fishermen Fishermen need to know which fish are around when, which shellfish are around when, the life cycles of those creatures. Um, if the pogies come, who else is coming? If the mackerel come, who else is coming? Who wants to eat the mackerel? Who wants to eat the seals? Um, and should you be swimming in places where there are things that the sharks want to eat? There are lots of ways of learning about the place that will help you not only live well there, but survive there too. Our forebears had to learn a lot of ways of living within places with other animals, and what, and learning about the plants, what plants to eat, what plants not to eat, what plants to use for healing. Because the natural world was the pharmacy for thousands of years. And how do we learn that? But there has also been the tendency to try to express your connection to those places. And when you go to Europe, for example, and if you're lucky enough, you can go into the caves and see 30,000 years ago that humans were expressing a connection to a lot of different animals in a very beautiful way. The art is really gorgeous. These were not crude, unsophisticated works of art. They're really beautiful, and most of them are about animals. Not in the cave systems in France. There are not many human figures. It's mostly animals. Um, so those folks, our early forebears, had relationships with the natural world in order to survive. We have better tools to help us survive and better stuff, but do we need that stuff? So when you're thinking about a land trust or a conservancy or like the place where I live, the farm where I live, we have a conservation easement for birds, bees, and butterflies. So we're thinking about the plants in the field and how we might attract more native bees. We're thinking about plants in the fields that might support butterfly populations. We're thinking about having the bobolinks come back, having the bluebirds come back, um, loons nesting down on the shore instead of cottages with rafts and powerboats. There are all sorts of considerations. Not cutting within 100 feet of the shore on the lake here is a consideration that's not just a human consideration. It's not just to filter out the water. It's also to provide places for shade for fish and places for birds to live and places for the deer to go down to take water and feel safe. So you gradually, if you love the place where you live, you're gradually learning more and more how to live there as a citizen of that place, and that doesn't necessarily mean just as a human citizen, but as a citizen of a wide range of species, many of whom we don't even know about yet. There's still many species which we carry around inside us that we don't know too much about yet. So there's always that constant process of learning. And I think that the more you learn, the more you're able to live in balance with a place, but also the more concerned you are with the ongoing destruction of the watersheds that the human impulse is providing. That the human way of living in the watershed is pretty destructive, and trying to make every place look the same. It shouldn't. And there are people in Maine like John Bunker who's trying to preserve. I know that in Harpswell there's interest in this. John Bunker trying to preserve the heritage apples, or the apples which have grown here in Maine. And every place has their heritage crops and their heirloom crops, and they've been sort of pushed aside so everybody has the same looking gorgeous, if you think they're gorgeous, tomato or apple, and they're not necessarily the plants that should be growing in those places and that are happy to be growing in those places and that are supposed to be growing in those places. Maybe with climate change someday we'll have olives growing here, but we don't now, and we should be celebrating the idea of eating locally. My mother and my grandmother, they were surprised that this was such a thing, because they said, well, on our road, that's what we had to eat. We had whatever was grown locally. We didn't have as much access to stuff that's brought from other regions, and what is used to transport them, the carbon footprint of the transportation. So as an artist, how do you create art which expresses those connections? And how are you trying to talk about it as a human being? Are you trying to talk about it as a member of a wider um, community? And what is a community? Is when you're thinking of a land trust in terms of a community, are you thinking of it as a community of humans, or are you including the best interests of a lot of different species around you? And in Harpswell, are you thinking of it as South Harpswell or Center Harpswell or West Harpswell or Orr's Island or Bailey's Island? You know, how do you define your watershed? Are those separate and distinct properties, or are they part of a larger system? Um, and how do you express that connection rather than that division? You know, how does everybody get together to talk about conserving spaces that you need in order for the water to be pure, or to protect the fish populations, or to protect the lobster population, so that people can work within the watershed in a way which is sustainable but local. You know, is that possible at this point? And how do you power that? Where does the power come from for the humans to do that? Um, so there were lots of ways that thinking in terms of a community, that you have to think outside of just the human population. And that's sort of the change that I think about, is the change from 20th and 21st century humans thinking of just ourselves, or 20th and 21st humans thinking of ourselves in relation with all the other species around us. And a lot of inspiration can come from looking at indigenous societies and the way that they lived, and sort of benefited from the community around them, but lacked as much of the destructive element as we have. And looking at their stories, their creation stories, their ways of naming, but then looking at the ways when other people arrived here too. I lived for a summer in Labrador, and we were looking at the way the Basque fishermen lived when they first came over here, and the way that the Norse around 1008 AD, when they came to Lansamado, and how they were they were fearful of the native people, and a lot of survival skills were lost because we didn't listen to, when we were first given some good advice about how to live here, we didn't listen to that. We had that bluster, for that European bluster, and we did away with that, literally. Um, I want to use it as one example also. Trevor Peterson, who's coming to speak next, he's going to talk about bats and wind turbines. I met Trevor's family, Trevor's father and mother, out on Isle Royal in Lake Superior, and Trevor's mother and father were doing Earthwatch programs, and they were running the moose count and the wolf count out on Isle Royal, which is a 45-mile long island in Lake Superior. And I was there as artist in residence for 3 weeks, supposedly, just to write poems and check it out. But they were very interested in the moose population, which at that point in the late 1990s, it had peaked pretty much. It was about 2,200 moose and about 30 wolves on an island that was 45 miles long. And the moose had basically eaten everything, and there were too many moose. The island could not sustain them, and you would walk through areas where the woods looked like there had been a fire up to about 8 feet high, and it was just basically where the moose had eaten everything. And then there were a couple of hard winters, and the moose died way back because the island wasn't sustainable. But also the wolves were not original to the island. They had come out in 1948 when the lake froze over, and they had come out on the ice and discovered this island with all these moose and no other predators. So it was kind of a wolf heaven for a while, but no other wolves joined them. So the insularity of the island caused all this inbreeding, and gradually the moose population fell away, and the moose population got bigger, and the wolf population fell away, and then the moose population was too big, and it died out quite heavily over several winters. So that kind of island population is really different from a larger landmass like North America, um, where there are lots of connections possible by walking and swimming and flying and also there are up and down migrations that like turtles and frogs migrate vertically rather than horizontally. But even I went on a dragonfly walk last year at the Cree Preserve, and we were told that some dragonflies migrate, and they may migrate in such large clouds that they can be picked up on radar, which is a wonderful image for me to think about. So I'm just sort of proposing that people try to make a map of where it is that you live and where your water comes from and where the wind comes from and where does the sun come up at different points of the year, and just think about what kind of stone is underneath your feet. Take a geology course, or there are all sorts of ways of exploring where you are that lead you to the hope that it will be saved and preserved somehow, and that the way you see it as beautiful is the way that it would stay as beautiful. That's not necessarily the way it wants to be. It doesn't necessarily have to be a trimmed lawn that looks great to some people. That kind of wild edge is where all the good stuff is happening. But if you find out who was here before, and that includes people who was here before, what languages were here before, what were these places called before, but then try to think about those places also in terms of how would a bird see this place and what would they call it, and what would the deer say about this place, or the bobcat who comes through, how does it feel about this. We know that there are species that do have a kind of spoken language, but there are all sorts of other ways of expression, um, chemical impulses or body movements or things. But then there's also within our own species the artistic expression of the place. That you can create music, you can create dance, you can create poetry, you can create art. But then there's also like local foods. Local foods are expressions of different places. You can think about places and think about, oh yeah, that's this kind of food. Or people come to Maine to have lobsters and see lighthouses. I mean, there's there's a kind of. So what would Maine be like if the lobster population was diminished to the point where people couldn't come to Maine to get, there were no longer a viable lobster fishery, or no longer viable, no longer clams. Now we're getting better and better oyster supply, but as the water temperatures change, and as the quality of the water hopefully is getting better. Our stores and our bookstores in Brunswick, and we remember what the Androscoggin looked like back in the 60s, and we know that it has gotten better. And a lot of that was from upriver, from industry along the rivers back when we weren't that cognizant of what industry was putting into the water. And industry is still putting things into the water, and lawmakers are still avoiding acting on some of that. And so we also need to be active politically in order to speak for the places where we live in that way. There needs to be human protection, and some of that is necessarily done through legislation. Some of that is done through joining your local land trust or land protection communities and going on walks and going to talks and learning as much about the place where you live as you can. And then being able to try to speak with that place and for that place and from that place, not just as a visitor who doesn't really understand. And I admit that I will never fully understand what's going on, even in the place where I live, because there's so much. It's so rich. You can choose sections of that to learn about, but you really will never know all of it, which is wonderful. It's sort of a great mystery. Astrophysicists are still just beginning to figure out what's going on, and which is great. We live in this great, beautiful mystery. But I think it's better to be co-inhabitants of a watershed. So anyway, that's my story of change. Is that I went out thinking I was going to become this, I was going to be a poet and write wonderful poems for the rest of my life. And I don't know what that meant. I was 21. I was crazy. I don't know what that really meant I was going to do. But what came out of it was the idea that I wanted to look at places on the planet and really try to have a different point of view about where it was that I was and what was happening there, and that I was not the apex of creation. I was not the greatest thing that had ever happened to this place, and some places would be just as well off if I was gone. Maybe most places would be just as well off. What is the human impact on the whole rest of, how many species go extinct every day? How many species do we have yet to name? It's just such a wonderful mix of life. How do we express it all, and how do we live joyously within it? So I think that land trusts, conservation organizations, things like that are wonderful places, not only to join the human community of people who share your interests, but to learn more and more about the wider community of creatures and life and natural habitats. It's not just necessarily creatures and life, although, as a poet, I think mountains are sentient. I think rivers are sentient. I think, we just don't know what sentience is. Is everything alive? Um, There's a question for you. Is everything alive? So let's see. Should I take a question? Are there questions? Julia, are there questions? Julie is gone.
I'm here. Let's see. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to type into the chat? Or I can click on allow you to talk if you want to ask your question through your sound versus typing it in.
Or I can keep going.
Yeah, I would say keep going.
Okay, okay.
Let's see, and folks can think about what questions that they have.
Okay. Well, I'd like to do that. So what I'm in trying to think about being a poet and being a poet who speaks from the natural world, I had several teachers. Of course, I told you that I went to live with Gary Snyder, and I'm just going to read a little poem of his called For the Children. The rising hills, the slopes of statistics lie before us, the steep climb of everything going up, up, as we all go down. In the next century, or the one beyond that, they say, are valleys, pastures. We can meet there in peace, if we can make it. To climb these coming crests, one word to you and your children. Stay together, learn the flowers, go light. So like I said, I like to do naming workshops where we rename the flowers. We rename the plants based on physical observation and an attempt at understanding what's going on with the plant and with the other plants around it, rather than, plants don't necessarily speak Latin, and they probably don't even care that they have Latin names. That's not what they call each other, I don't think. That's just conjecture, since it's hard to directly know so far, but you can see what plants are doing, and how they're interacting with each other, and it's a fun process of trying to rename things. My other big mentor I met when I was living at Gary Snyder's was a wandering Japanese poet named Nanao Sakaki. So I'm going to read just a poem of his. That's good advice. If you have time to chatter, read books. If you have time to read, walk into mountain, desert, ocean. If you have time to walk, sing songs and dance. If you have time to dance, sit quietly, you happy, lucky idiot. sometimes you just need to sit quietly and let the things that are happening around you inform you of where you are and what's going on around you. And you gradually realize more and more and more is going around you that you haven't picked up on, that you haven't noticed necessarily before. So there's always constantly things happening around you in the natural world that aren't necessarily trying to communicate with you. You know, the birds aren't there to talk to you. The animals aren't necessarily there to talk to you. The trees aren't there to talk to you. There is communication possible. And the longer you hang out with those creatures, the more you, I think, you come to believe that there is communication possible. I'll read one more poem. I'll read. My grandfather was connected. He grew up in Prospect and Frankfort, up on the Penobscot River, and where there are the main occupation up there was granite quarries. And we've gone up. We visited my grandfather's quarry. I'm pretty interested in stones these days, so I'm just going to read a little poem from my grandfather's quarries. My grandfather, Lester Dow, came from Prospect, Maine. Prospect and its neighboring town, Frankfort, were granite towns, with quarries on Mount Waldo and Mosquito Mountain. Lester had a store in Prospect, serving the local farmers and quarrymen. My grandfather, Lester, walked down to his store at the crossroads of town, now buried with Hannah, his wife, across the road, low on the hillside, there also my mother's first school. My uncle walked down to the marsh and Bucksport beyond to the mill, making paper. The mill now closed down. From Prospect, the land falls down to the river, Penobscot to Bucksport beyond, and the whole world somewhere below us now. We have been to those quarries, touched the stone. In granite time, stone time, things move slowly. My grandfather has just left. I can almost hear his voice. I hear the granite singing, and it is alive. I want to tell you that granite is a migratory species. Think plate tectonics, continental drift, glacial erratics. And you can read the flow lines from when granite was liquid and moving quickly. I want to tell you that lichen is a language of granite, that granite speaks with water and air and light. We might never know what stories it holds deep within the rock. I can almost hear his voice. That's another thing about when you're thinking about where you are, thinking in terms of time. You're thinking how long that granite has been there and how long the lichen has been developing on the surface of the granite. That it's very different from human time. There's a whole other kind of time, and you know, human time may be a human construct anyway, because there could be superluminal particles coming through there that are going faster than the speed of light. You know, so time, you know, is kind of a way that we humans measure things, but it's not necessarily the way anything else measures things. Julia, you look like there's a question.
There's two actually.
Wow.
So one says, how can we help folks learn that they are part of nature instead of apart from it?
I would say get them out into it. Do what you guys are doing. Have walks, have talks, make it fun. Make it not just a kind of stuffy classroom situation, but go out and explore. I think humans like to explore. You know, humans like to be out in the world and exploring and not being taught in a specific Western educational way. You know, how do you teach your kids? You don't just sit them down and tell them stuff. You show them stuff and you take them out and do stuff together. And I think that's really a wonderful function of any kind of land trust or community organization like that, is to get out and have. I mean, I'm leading a walk for the Cathans River group in a couple of weeks, and we're going to talk about poetry and go for a walk. And I'm just going to ask people how they would express different at different moments, like express what you're hearing. What are you smelling? What are you seeing? What are you sensing? You know, we tried to make a audio map of the preserve, and just where do you stop hearing traffic? Where do you start hearing the river? things like which birds do you hear at which times of the year? Do you hear crickets? Do you hear tree frogs? Or do a smell map, which is a pretty interesting actually walk, because you don't usually, your brain isn't always telling you everything you want that's coming in. So let's take a walk, and which parts of the preserve, where can you smell mud? Where do you smell pine? Where do you, it's kind of a fun, put all your senses to work, because we have them. We have all these abilities to explore the natural world. We don't necessarily use it. But yeah, get out and do it. Get out and go.
Yeah, that's what I'm in the midst of right now with our nature camp, is
Yeah.
getting out there, being a part of nature. There's another person who writes, since Gary spent time in California with Gary Snyder, how does he feel about the natural changes in nature there? Fire, drought, landslides, etc.
Well, where I lived, where Gary Snyder lives, it's at the 3,500-foot line in the Sierras, and it doesn't rain. Well, back then it didn't rain for 7 months a year. Who knows now if it even rains at all? So the forest fire danger was really high, and you had to be really aware of anything that could cause a spark, because the ground was just incredibly dry, and it was a oak madrone forest, and there was a lot of pine duff, a lot of stuff that would go up. And of course, the Native Americans didn't necessarily practice fire suppression. And there, when you go through those forests, there are trees who have adapted to fire so that the cones don't open and spread seeds until they're heated, right? I mean, they need fire in order to reproduce. So that's I think we have we build in places we shouldn't build. We build ridiculous places that should burn down, I think, but that's a bad thing to say, I suppose. But we build in places where we shouldn't build. We build in floodplains, and then we want the feds to pay us money for the water rose. Well, the water was going to rise. Or, there was a fire. Well, there was going to be a fire. This is, and if you are still denying that climate change is happening, and yet there are these fires and these floods and all this stuff happening, that doesn't look like it's necessarily the natural cycle of things, maybe you should learn what the natural cycle was and how you're affecting the natural cycle. So where we lived in California, a big worry was fire. We had to be really careful. And there was, in fact, a big fire when I was there, and it was pretty devastating, but kind of exciting, but awful for the animals who lived there. And lightning caused fires are natural. Utility caused fires, I mean, I think California utilities are causing as many fires as lightning is, but not owning up to it. Oh, I'm seeing questions. Look at that.
Yeah. I want to read this one because I think it's good, and I'm just going to read it in its entirety. It says, yes, we should each know our watersheds. I like to say I was born in the Saco, grew up in the Androscoggin, went to school in the Penobscot, lived in the Kennebec, and now live in the Mirror Brook watershed. And then the question, how do we balance the interests of the Wabanaki, the descendants of the first peoples here, with the interests of all the other people who live here now?
I would say first by treating them with respect and listening to them. I think we have colonized them for a couple hundred years. We've kind of pushed them off. We've taken everything we could take. Now we're they bring bills to the legislature. They have a sovereignty bill. We table it and send it off. They have a casino bill. The governor vetoes it. There's a lack of listening, I think, and realizing whose land we live on. I mean, this land wasn't always ours. Wasn't theirs either. I mean, before that, nobody lived here. There was a glacier here. It was kind of hard to live here. But we took it, and then we took their culture. We took children away and put them in schools and made them learn English and made them become white people and tell them. I mean, we told kids that their parents didn't want them, their tribes didn't want them. That's how do you address those wounds? I mean, I think, to me, one of the greatest gifts you can give to other human beings is to listen to them with your heart, and really listen and really pay attention, and not just try to I mean, right now I'm telling people what I think, but not just necessarily, not you try to tell them, but to listen to them tell you, and it's fun to do that with, like, in Brunswick, we have New Mainers who are just getting here, and they've lived in a place where it's never snowed, and the foods were different, and the music was different, and the language was different, and the religion was different, the whole culture, it was all different, and here's an opportunity to learn from them about what this place looks like to them instead of all the ways we've been told it looks like. So what, so I love that part of the process as well. Like learning how this place looked to the indigenous people who were here before us. What did they see when they looked around, and how did they respond to that? And one of those things, those cool projects is naming. I think there's a photographer, Jim McCarthy from Brunswick right now, who is photographing places that go with particular indigenous place names from the Fanny Hardy Ekstrom book, and looking at what Sebascodegan meant, what Maricanig meant, and what happened there, and taking pictures to kind of document what still happens there, which is a lovely way of learning where you are.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Another person is interested in having you describe the watershed you lived in Labrador.
In Labrador, I lived near the mouth of the Pinware River, which was coming down from interior Labrador to the sea. It was in the late 90s, it was a really rich salmon river. There were a lot of trout, and then right outside we were on the Labrador Current, so there was really cold water coming down out of Hudson's Bay and down the Labrador coast, and then it would go down and meet the Gulf of St. Lawrence, so it would meet the St. Lawrence River. So there was a really rich place there. In the late 90s, when I was living there were icebergs every day all summer. There was a really good cod fishery. There were whales. It was just a really rich but kind of cold place. And I kept thinking I was really far north, and then I would look at a map and I was as far north as Scotland. I wasn't really that far north. It was southern Labrador, but no trees taller than 3 or 4 feet. A lot of marsh, a lot of bog, a lot of carnivorous plants in the bogs. The berries were like bake apple, cloudberries. I mean, it was definitely a different place, and but I had always wanted to go north and see what it was like to be a little further up. And also, I was there in 1979, 1980, and they didn't yet have electricity in the towns. So I was seeing, to me, what an English fishing town on the coast of North America was like 100 years ago. Because people were going to each other's houses at night and singing and playing music, and people were putting up their fish with salt or drying things. They were eating seal. And nobody locked their door. So what was that community like then? And they were really dependent on fish. They couldn't raise vegetables. It was too cold to raise vegetables. There was no good soil for that. So they were really dependent on fish and seals. And of course, I show up and I'm this long-haired American in 1979, 1980. The only long-haired Americans they saw were Greenpeace activists coming to try to stop the seal hunt. So people would be, they'd be friendly but wary, and then they would invite me to supper, and they'd say, we're having seal tonight. And that would be the moment where my fate would be cast. So I'd say fine, and then it'll be okay. It'd be all right. They figured he must not be one of those Greenpeace people,
That's
who,
interesting.
yeah. Well, there's an environmental movement that sort of lacked understanding of local culture. Had sort of the right idea, but not quite the right way of going about it. Because most of those guys weren't killing little baby seals. They were killing like 1 or 2 big seals a year. Like here, we were killing a deer. I mean, it was a similar practice, and they would eat everything and use the skins for clothes. And it was not just clubbing little baby white seals, which is pretty monstrous. But yeah.
Right. Well, does anyone else have any questions or anything they'd like to talk about tonight?
It's a quiet bunch out there.
Yeah, well, that's what you get doing it over Zoom. Quiet.
Very quiet.
Um, Do you want to read us another poem?
Sure. I always want to do that,
Right. I do love them.
This is since Trevor's coming. When I got out onto the island at Isle Royal, I was kind of looking around and the plants were different, and I wasn't used to being in a place where there were wolves. And then they told me that there were all these migratory birds that flew through there, and all these like cranes, all these wonderful birds that came through there, and as a way of getting down from the north and then down through North America. This was a big island in the middle of the lake, so they would settle there for a little bit. So here's a little Isle Royal, a place where the wolves are wanted, where human beings bring our awkward blessings to moosebone, wolf scat, loon song, where we allow ourselves to blossom among marsh marigold, rock harlequin, calypso orchid, Labrador tea, where we peel back layers of fog, of moss, of rock itself. Inside there is sunlight. Inside there is wolf song, the light step of the moose, the berries waiting to ripen where the light never touches, yet all this light at the heart of things. So I've been reading these astrophysics books lately, and they were talking about the time after the Big Bang when there was no light and no stars, and thinking about a really dark universe. There was a long time when there was no light, and sometimes that big light up in the sky is going to engulf us, and there'll be no Earth anymore. It's going to engulf everything out to Jupiter at some point and burn us all up. So the light will change. The light will change, and the light we're seeing in the sky, is coming from millions of years ago. A lot of the news that we see in those stars every night happened a really long time ago. So our time as humans in this beautiful place is pretty short, pretty short. And then there are critters whose lifetimes are way shorter than ours. So what is time, and what is a citizenship to a place? The granite has been around for a long time, but some of it used to think it was Europe, and then now it's over here. So it's migratory as well. The granite has moved. Everything on the planet is moving, and not just in time. So that currently is interesting me. But it's I'm feeling very, very connected, but that I shouldn't feel like humans will be here forever. We won't be here forever. Look at all the species who are already gone. Their time is over. Glaciers may be gone. There are things. Water won't be gone, but glaciers may be gone. And yet we give glaciers names, like they have personalities. We give mountains names. We give rivers names. Do they know their names? What would they call themselves? What does this river that's flowing through a mountain say to the mountain? And then it hits Casco Bay. And I think, all of us around here are citizens of Casco Bay too. So we should be pretty concerned about what's going into the bay.
Yeah, I love the idea of renaming things. Imagining.
Well, every culture does that. Every language group, every culture does that. We rename things, It's just, what do they call themselves?
Right.
Even indigenous peoples, we have names for them. We don't ask them what they call themselves because we don't know how to spell it or pronounce it. So we just give them a different name. Or immigrants, when they arrive here, when people are migrating from Europe and they have an Eastern European name with a lot of consonants, they get to Ellis Island, they're given a new name that's easier for us to pronounce in the European world. It's a constant process, and renaming might signify your greater understanding of something or your lack of understanding of something. It's so it's an interesting process in that way. It's revealing, I think. Yeah. So how many preserves does your group have now, or how many trails and preserves in Harpswell?
There's 17 preserves.
Oh,
A number of, I forget how many of those have trails, but most of them have
yeah.
trails. We have a couple trails that aren't on preserves. Yeah, a lot of places in Harpswell to get outdoors and enjoy
And,
it.
and and I know that there's been a move to tell the invasive plants they're not necessarily as wanted as the native plants are. Shall we say that there is a move to
There is,
eradicate some of the
yeah,
visitors?
yeah. I don't know if eradication is realistic, but
Possible, yeah, yeah.
control at least.
At
Yeah,
least slowing down their incursion a little bit, yeah.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
So that's a good thing. But then people need to know, because some people think purple loosestrife is a pretty plant and they'd like to have it, and just or,
Yeah, that is true.
but who are you, what local are you displacing in order to have that there? I mean, who is disappearing and who eats it? Who used to eat the plants that aren't there anymore?
Yeah, and that's the whole point behind native. I mean, that's part of the point behind native plants is it's part of a system
Yeah, yeah.
that other species are depending on.
And we have a way of getting rid of pollinators with roadside sprays and chemical sprays for orchards and that kind of thing. We're doing away with the local little critters in order to increase production of a food crop, a human food crop.
Right. Well, do we have any last thoughts before we sign off for tonight? Anyone have any last questions? Or Gary, do you have any last thoughts?
You know, well, I have a question. How can all these people support your work?
Mm. Well, there's lots of ways to support our work. Um, there's volunteering, there's of course donating money, there's just being a voice for conservation in Harpswell and, you know, going out and visiting the preserves and getting, just like what you're saying, is getting to know the places and getting to love them and learning about them and learning about all the different plants and animals that live here, and then being a voice of support for conserving those places. And there's tons of things that people can do on their own land. Planting those native flowers that the pollinators need, and making good habitat, not having lawns that get mowed right down to the water. There's lots of things that everyone can do, big and small, to support the goal of conservation in Harpswell, and broader than Harpswell too, of course.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Well, I think we'll say good night. Thanks so much, Gary. Really enjoyed it.
Good night.
All right. Good
Thank
night.
you.